Welcome to In Focus, brought to you from the Up North Media Center. I'm your host, Kimberli Bindschatel. With me is my co-host, Anthony Weber. Together we have three guests with us, and we're going to talk about the modern search for a meaningful life. With us in the studio is Vickie Green. Vickie is a school counselor, or has been for over 30 years. She is now a licensed professional counselor, a life coach, and a spiritual mentor. Welcome.
Thank you.
Next to her is Scott Blair. Scott is here from the Grand Traverse Humanists group. He is the vice president and a member. He's also a participant in ACCORD, which is the Area Council on Religious Diversity. He holds a Bachelor of Science degree in biology from the University of Michigan and has worked in the wastewater treatment field. Thanks for joining us. And Bryan is with us, Bryan Berghoef. He is a pastor and a pub theologian. He's going to tell us what that is in a little bit. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah.
So this search for a meaningful life in the modern world, we usually in the In Focus team, we discuss an idea up front, kind of sit down together, and with this we kept coming back to the idea of religion. It seems historically religion is where most people looked to find meaning. And there was a study out recently, a Pew Research study, that basically states that religious activity is waning, and that people are now, when surveyed, more and more are checking the box none, and kind of forecasted that by 2050, that 25%, 1 out of 4 people, will be checking the box none. So that seems significant. And so Bryan, I wanted to start with you, if I could. If you could just kind of give us your feeling, being a pastor, and if you can explain the pub theology concept a little bit. And have you been sensing this in your lifetime recently, this change or move away from religion? And is it directly tied to seeking meaning?
It's a good question, Kimberli. Thank you. So just to explain pub theology briefly, it's a gathering of folks at a local brewery or bar to have open conversation over a beer or a lemonade or whatever you prefer to drink, and talk about things like meaning, life, faith, politics, identity, those kinds of things. And so sure, this kind of stuff has come up in those conversations and in that setting. And I saw the study also that came out, and I think there are a number of factors that are a part of data like that. I think people have an increasing distrust of institutions in general, but I think particularly religious institutions, and I think we see that among younger generations, millennials and so forth, where maybe they learned something at some point or were taught something along the way, growing up, attending services, going to church, and then maybe they did some reading or had met some friends from a different perspective, or went to college and heard some things that maybe were in tension with what they had learned in the church. And I think that causes a little bit of distrust. Well, if I was told this and that doesn't quite seem to be the case, what else am I maybe not able to trust? And so I think that's one factor. I think also just the accessibility of information, and the fact that people can go online and read about all kinds of things and learn about other perspectives, learn about other religious traditions, learn why some people aren't religious at all, and engage those ideas. I think they're much more accessible than they have been in the past. And so I think people are beginning to say, well, maybe I'm going to own my own search for meaning, and it may be in the church, but it may not be, but I want it to be on my terms. And so some have chosen, I'm going to find it in that institution or in that community of a church, and others are finding it in other places. And I think these two might share some of those instances. So I think there's a few factors, and I think more will come up as we converse.
Do you think, Bryan, that people are purposefully seeking meaning, even as they're leaving religion more and more and going to science or the arts or travel or friendship?
Right.
Do you think that they're approaching that with the idea that I am on a search for meaning, or is it maybe a sense that there's something more, and in the process they find that other things are meaningful to them?
That's a terrific question. I think I wouldn't know what numbers are. I think it does depend on the individual. I think some folks are very introspective and want to really search out meaning, and I think maybe those kinds of folks are more attracted to a pub theology type setting where we can really get into some issues and wrestle and discuss together. But other folks aren't really, as you said, worried about it that much. It's, well, what's fun or what's interesting to me, and that's meaningful, and that's great. And if church isn't fun anymore, or if have a bad experience, maybe they're not thinking that deeply about the underpinnings theologically and philosophically. They just had a bad experience, and I don't want to repeat a bad experience. So I think it really depends on the person, but it's a great question.
Do you find that, Vickie? Yeah,
Well,
go
I was
ahead.
just going to say, what comes up for me is the word evolving or evolution, that the structures that worked for years ago, they're all falling apart. I mean, let's face it, the institutions are falling apart. It's not working, and no matter what we do to try to fix the infrastructure of those institutions, they're falling apart, and we need new ways of connecting, I think, of finding meaning and connecting with other people, because that's one of the purposes, I think, of the old churches. It was finding meaning, but also a way to connect socially with other people in the communities.
So it used to be the predominant form of a community experience, and that's shifting quite a bit.
Yeah.
Do you find with your students, you've worked with students for 30 years, I believe?
Well, first of all, I retired in '06, and my final 15 years was with elementary kids, so great experience. But since then, I've had a practice, and primarily I'm working with adults now, more so than kids.
How do your clients approach this issue? Or maybe a different way to ask it is, how do you help your clients move in that direction? I'm making an assumption here, you can correct me if I'm wrong, that if people are coming to you for life coaching and you've described what you do as you're kind of helping them explore spirituality, be purposeful about their future, how are the ways that you approach walking someone through looking at their life, organizing their life, being purposeful about their life in ways that I assume kind of boils down to searching for something that's meaningful?
Yeah. Well, first of all, people come for counseling or therapy or whatever it is for all kinds of different reasons. And so the place that I start is figuring out where are they at, because I may think I want to get them here, that they could benefit from going to X, Y, or Z, but if they're not there, I'm not going to get them there. So it really is starting with where they are and looking at what is their agenda, what do they want. But I'm actually in a huge transition right now, in that I'm really wanting to focus more on clients that are there for wellness, that are there for life coaching, looking at what do I want my future, what kind of a future do I want to create. And even with the whole idea of spiritual mentoring, that doesn't mean that somebody has to believe in a God. It may be just that they're questioning the whole thing, all these ideas for the first time in their life, which I had a thought when you were talking about something that I thought, I think we were raised, and my generation was raised, that you don't question. You just kind of accept what is. And I think, I think back to the whole idea of evolution, that's changed, that we really are beginning to question. We know we don't have to go through a church or a God to get to whatever the source is. It can come in a lot of different forms.
I think that's a good one brief, and then we'll let Scott jump in. I think that's a great point you make, that people have, another reason perhaps behind those statistics about people searching for meaning beyond religious boundaries is wanting to ask questions and freedom to do that. And I think to the extent the church doesn't create space for open questions and exploration, it's going to have a negative effect. And so I think spaces like pub theology or other settings where people find a voice and can ask questions and not be worried about being asked to leave if they ask certain questions or don't subscribe to certain beliefs. I think we're going to see more interest in that going forward.
And are we seeing growth in the humanist movement then as well?
Certainly, we're getting bigger and having lots of fun. The 25% that identify as none or nons, just to be fair and clear, they're not all eschewing the supernatural. Some of them still believe in a supernatural entity or a God, but they are disenchanted with organized religion, and they might find a home in the kind of events that Bryan puts on, or they might find a home in something like the humanists, the Grand Traverse Humanists, for example. Representing humanism, we don't, unlike the 75 or more %, we don't look to the idea of a supernatural or an imagined entity for meaning or service to such an entity as meaning or for meaning. Rather, we would believe that meaning emerges from our human nature. Humankind is a part of and a product of nature. We emerge from a natural process of evolution, and our brains, with all its complex chemistry, is part of us. It's part of the humanity that emerged through this process of biological evolution. And our characteristics, I mean, everybody, I think, can intuitively understand how evolution can produce brain chemistry or compulsions or thinking styles that would cause a person to pursue their self-interest and their self-pleasure, sex, food, comfort. But this process has also produced the more complex and noble characteristics of humankind, like altruism and support for family and neighbors. These deeply human compulsions come out of a selection process that favored a cooperative behavior. As humankind began to evolve as a social species, those kind of behaviors of supporting one another enhanced the success of groups, whereas selfish behaviors enhance the success of individuals. So the whole range of human nature was conserved. These seemingly contradictory characteristics, good and evil, if you will, in some other people's terms, those parts of our nature were conserved in evolution, in a tension and a balance with one another. And meaning in life emerges from those characteristics. Some of the meaning in a person's life comes out of pursuing those more selfish things, the pleasure, sex, power, comfort, and some of the meaning in life doesn't necessarily come from pleasure, but the complex gratification that comes from serving others and building something that's bigger than oneself. But they all go back to those thinking characteristics that are part of our brain chemistry that are a legacy of the process of biological evolution.
So do you think, as I'm listening to you describe that, and I'm thinking of the history, anthropological history of humankind, which goes hand in hand with the history of religion. As far back as we can tell, the idea of looking skyward or elsewhere, that they were connected. And what I'm wondering then is, where in the process, and maybe this is a question for you, Bryan, did it become a structured thing? Did it come hand in hand with as societies were built? That we went from hunter-gatherer and that to societies where then we felt structure was needed and some kind of moral code, that there wasn't enough trust in each other, that we needed to have an overlord. What's the history then of that and how it relates to a sense of meaning now in a modern world?
It's a good question, and I'll give my 2 cents.
We've got more.
I've got something for that as well.
These two can jump in, but I do think, as far back as we can trace human civilizations and records of any sort of writing or art, we often find story and meaning, and I think that speaks to the fact that we are looking for something beyond ourselves that sustains us, not just survival level, but beyond, in a sort of an existential sense. And am I a part of something that's more than just me? And I think part of that is just making sense of our environment and our world, our universe, which you know, we've seen that shift over time, and, you know, we would see maybe some cave drawings with some sort of nascent religious ideas, and then those things become more developed as humankind becomes more complex and thinking becomes more complex, and certain traditions begin to develop and take on more of a institution, and they get codified, and then those things become the things we look to, because that's what maybe we were born into, or what our own heritage is, and so we naturally are introduced to those things, and then it's up to us to explore that, own it, look at other possibilities. So I think we've been looking for that meaning for a long time.
So what's the shift then? So now in this modern world,
Okay.
right, now there's a shift, and I'm suspecting it has something to do with the rise in science, and now we have a much broader and better understanding of our world through the scientific method of, you know, that kind of exploration. Do you think that's partially to do with this shift away from religious thought to?
I think it's part of it, and maybe Scott could speak to that as well. In fact, I'm sure he can. But I also think it's an increasing freedom that people sense to do the exploring. Because I think we've known some of these scientific things for quite a while, but I think there's an increasing access to it, but also freedom to
Well, now that the
question
Inquisition
and
is
rethink.
over,
Yeah,
right?
there you go.
I mean,
there you go.
that's in the past, so.
And it may depend on one's own subculture, right? Because I think some folks are born or are in a tradition where that thinking or rethinking still isn't encouraged. And so things look a lot the same as they did 80, 100 years ago, whereas in other places there is more rethinking and more permission to think again.
Yeah, I think religiosity itself is a tendency in thinking that is also a part of our legacy, our biological legacy. It was conserved by evolution, that tendency to envision that there is an entity looking over us. As we grow up, we're accustomed to parental oversight, and we sort of, our train of thought is sort of in terms of English and dialogue, so we envision that we're, in our mental life, that we're talking to somebody. And from an evolutionary perspective, from the evolution of social behavior, the belief, the collective or the communal belief in a God that has certain rules and that sort of unseen, omnipresent enforcer, you know, added to a cohesiveness that helped groups succeed. It was part of that whole evolutionary picture. Regarding science and modern information making religious stories less plausible, I think that's absolutely part of the increase in the nuns. Again, it's not all of it. Some people are put off by organization and religion, but some people certainly are drifting away because they find those old mythologies, as I do, completely, you know, implausible and incompatible with the physical world that you see around you if you actually look at it in a dispassionate way.
It's funny you mentioned parents, because that's what I just scribbled down here right before you started talking, because I was thinking of my parents saying, "Because I said so." And I see parents, you know, the parenting styles have changed as well. You know, more children these days are talked to in a very different way. So it's funny that you brought that up.
You know, as you talk about the shift of, I think you might have used the term like overlords, and we've talked about God, or we've talked about father figures or parental figures. It strikes me that even though there's a shift moving away from religion, it's a shift that's not moving away from underneath another higher source. It's like meaning has shifted to look to something else that's bigger than ourselves to find meaning. Do you think that is just part of human nature, that we are inclined to continue to place ourselves underneath the umbrella of something bigger than ourselves? Or do you think that part of the change that's happening is an increasing rejection of anything that is above us in any sense of the word?
Shall I go after that?
Scott.
I think as I talk with people in venues like this, or pub theology, or humanists, it seems like there's a couple of different visceral reactions to bigger than ourselves. There's some people who are inclined towards religiosity and look for meaning in that way, because when they look out, even with the advantage of some of the new information we have in our modern age, and they realize how vast the universe is, how big time is, and how, in some people's words, we're this insignificant little speck. You know, some people look at that and they feel minimized, and then they want to connect with the source of all that bigness and make them feel important again. I look at it from, and then the other kind or the other reaction is the opposite one, and this is mine, is that I look at that bigness and I look at the coherence of nature that is represented throughout it, and I don't think I'm an insignificant speck. I think, here's all this space, all this matter, all these natural laws working, and most of it, everywhere but here, that we can see is inanimate. And through these unguided natural processes, they happen in this place, in this time, on this planet, in this time, have produced the product of these natural laws, the physics, the chemistry, the biology, the psychology. So out of these natural forces emerges the ability to have this full, rich experience of being human. To me, that's the opposite of the reductionism. We don't, people who look at the world empirically don't belittle ourselves by reducing everything to physical laws. Rather, we see this emergent, figuratively magic phenomena of being able to have this rich experience of being human out of this unguided, sterile, natural world. So to me, that's exalting, and I find meaning in that. and I think it's frustrating and unnecessary for people to viscerally feel belittled by the bigness of space and time. Rather, they can feel rather special within it because of this rare thing that's happened that's caused us to emerge from it and experience being alive.
Go ahead, Vickie.
I forgot your question, but the thought that came up to me as I was listening to you was that as I have evolved, as I have grown up and matured and questioned things and evolved, my concept of God or a higher being has evolved to a place now where I would say it will just continue to evolve, that I can never begin to actually define God and think I have the answer, because by nature, it's going to be wrong. Deepak Chopra wrote a book several years ago. I think it was called How to Know God. And I read that book, and basically his premise was that years ago when cavemen were first here, God was a very punishing God, that if they did something and it stormed, their interpretation was they were being punished. Well, just kind of fast forward to where we are today, we would kind of laugh at that kind of interpretation. But I think, my concept now is one of God being just an energy. It's just an energy that's there that I just know is there. I can feel it, but can I define it? Do I want to define it? I think it's it's evolving. It's a living organism for me to define it.
So is the mystery of it part of the meaningfulness of it?
I think there is a mysteriousness, mysteriousness, a mysticalness, depending on the direction that you want to go with, absolutely. And the fact that we do keep evolving. And I also believe that spirituality and science, that they're merging, that there's less distinction. And when we're really open, when you look at concepts of metaphysics or quantum physics, which I don't begin to understand, but I keep hearing it over and over again. So there's that part of me that says there's got to be something here. Just because I don't understand it doesn't mean it's not truth. But so I think there's a definite merger between all of those different forces.
I observe a lot of what I think is inappropriate blending of science and spirituality. People borrow from quantum physics to form a worldview that is fluffy and interesting, but not real, not really applying science. I am okay. I accept the term spirituality applied to a person like myself if I have the opportunity to define it. I mean, I could say I'm a spiritual person. I don't believe in anything supernatural. I believe everything that happens is natural. That the universe behaves wonderfully in accordance with these coherent rules, so that everything that happens is by definition natural, not supernatural. And supernatural means violate the rules of nature, which essentially violate the rules of existence. But to be spiritual is, I think, to be deeply interested in essence. You know, when one of the synonyms of the spirit of a thing is the essence of a thing, the spirit of a law, or the spirit of a story or something. You know, spirit means essence. So for someone to be deeply concerned with the essence of things, that can be a very, a person who is interested in understanding the world as it really is, as nature really behaves, without reliance on supernatural. You could still be spiritual, but I wouldn't use that word in company where I didn't have the opportunity to state that.
It's less gratifying when someone else is defining it for you.
Well, they would tend to associate the word spiritual with supernatural, and I equate supernatural with imaginary.
Right.
What do you feel about the tension or lack of tension between religion and science? Do you feel like they both offer meaningfulness to life, or do you feel like they're at odds with each other?
It's a good question. Well, clearly they do both offer some sort of meaning or framework or understanding of human existence. And as we've noted, religion has been around a long time, and exploring of our environment has been around quite a while, but it's gotten more in focus, and we've had increasing ability to do that at a better level, deeper level in the last, 300-500 years, but even more recently. So I think they can be at odds depending on how one interprets what they have to offer. I don't think they necessarily need to be at odds. I mean, I'm a Christian, and I do believe that a divine power exists, and I also hold a certain amount of mystery to that, as Vickie noted. But I also don't think of myself as someone who hears science and thinks, oh, well, that must be, a bunch of, I mean, I don't have a lot of reason to distrust what a latest study says that's done by, educated scientists who are operating, in a environment in which that can be peer reviewed and, substantiated by other colleagues and so forth. I don't have reason to distrust that at all. I think when it can come to odds is when we're thinking about things like the origins of the universe. So certain interpretations of Genesis or other creation stories, perhaps from other religions, if they're believed to say something that is at odds with what science seems to tell us about those things, then it can be at odds. So I have friends, who are young Earth creationists and believe the world is 6,000 to 9,000 years old, and they do that on their reading of the book of Genesis, and I find that quite problematic because I think the earth is much older than that, and I think we have pretty good evidence that that's the case. So there I see it as an interpretive difference, and it gets made as a religion versus science thing, and I think, well, you're just interpreting a text that wouldn't have made any sense if it was talking about scientific origins when it was written, however many thousands of years ago. That would have had no meaning for its first readers. And so if a text wouldn't have had much meaning for its first readers, that's probably not our first place to go for understanding what that text actually does mean, did mean then, and might mean now. So things like that, I'm happy to look at that as allegory, parable, something like that, rather than a literal definition of where humanity and when humanity came on the scene.
When I think about meaning and a meaningful life, meaningfulness in my own life, I automatically think about death. Like that's yes. Where I'm led, and I think I've often thought that that's been kind of the origins of religion too, because we don't know what happens after we die, and it's a scary thing to think that one day, you know, of our own demise. We almost have this beautiful ability in our brains to deny that, you know, kind of thing. And in terms of that, I personally want to leave the world a better place because I was here. You know, I know that sounds kind of hokey, but you know, I feel that I want to do something that has some meaning, back to that word. And I think of that old, I think there was a song or a poem about the dots, you know, on your tombstone. There's the date you're born and the date you die and those dots in between. And I remember that being so, well, poetic, you know, what are you going to do with those dots? And so I'm wondering, again, in this modern world, those, you know, as everyone, it seems like, is searching for meaning, their own meaning, what to do with those dots. If we kind of head that way in our conversation, what are you finding out there in your conversations that people are doing, or where they're looking to fulfill that? What are they doing with those dots that is meaningful to them?
Great question.
I like that you mention death, because it makes the perfect thought experiment for what is meaningful. And I do this sometimes. I do this thought experiment. I think, what, you know, if I am to die, and it was made vivid for me, this can happen to anybody, I'm sure it does. I just happened to have a dream about a week ago that I was going to die, so it was very vivid for about 10 minutes in the morning when I woke up, right?
My goodness.
And
where's that coffee?
And I think, if I'm going to die, what matters? It's, you know, in the dream, my wife and my dad were with me. I don't know why. I wanted to see my mom. I thought about the boat projects that I hadn't finished yet. And I thought, oh, I'm not going to finish fixing my wife's bicycle. And there's things I want to tell people at work about how you develop cool functional work environments and functional staffs and treat wastewater really well. I mean, I wanted that message. And I have a certain political sensibility that I wanted to spread, I get out there. And when you think about death, it is the lens to recognize what's meaningful. I mean, to imagine that I wanted to fix my wife's bicycle, but this is what's meaningful in my day-to-day life. I want to finish that project. I want my wife's bicycle to be done for her. You know, I want to do my boat projects. This gives meaning to our lives.
It sounds like you're saying, if you were looking back, as the end is coming and we're looking back and we're thinking, I wish I didn't have to leave that undone. That was important. That's a good framework to discover the things that are meaningful for us to do.
Kind of like the Christmas Carol. Is that the movie, the Christmas Carol, with the... Help me out here. Isn't he looking at his life?
Right.
Yeah, you know, yeah.
But the meaning is in our life. It's in our life right here and right now.
Getting his wings.
And we're squandering our life and opportunity if we invest the pursuit of meaning in what happens after our life, because I think, contrary to what you said, that we don't know what happens, it's very reasonable to say that nothing happens. I mean, there's reasonable...
Well, that's a whole other conversation.
It could be. But relevant to this conversation, if a person believes that you essentially stop being a conscious being upon death, that is very important in the meaning of your life.
Yes.
And I would say that meaning is here and now, and also legacy, as you've described, because, and this is part of our biological heritage, many of us have a compulsion to want to leave, to be part of building something that is good and bigger than ourselves. And that, for an atheist or for somebody who believes you are dead when you die, that's the forms that it takes. It's a legacy.
Vickie and Bryan, how does the concept of death figure into your reflections on meaning in life?
Go ahead.
Well, I come from the standpoint of having a soul, and that soul kind of was here before I arrived on the planet, and that it will continue on afterwards. So when I think of meaning of life, I think it's like a soul connection. It's how do I connect with my truth, my voice, my soul in this moment, in this, during this lifetime.
Bryan, any thoughts?
Yeah, well, that's been a big part of the Christian heritage, is that death has been dealt with in and through the life of Jesus and the resurrection of Jesus, and that provides, I think, a powerful sense of certainly comfort and meaning for people as we're wondering, well, what does happen when I die? And I think we, for the most part, don't want this ride to end.
Right.
And so, if there's the possibility that I can reconnect with great-grandma or someone near to me who died tragically too young, or whatever the situation is, there's an incredible amount of comfort in this thought that this isn't it, and there is, life after this. And, I remember speaking at my grandfather's funeral, and that was actually, I think, the first funeral I attended, and I was also speaking at it. And yeah, there's just a sense of comfort that we said goodbye, but somehow in some way we just have this hope and trust, and it's not sure knowledge, or it's not, I'm not going to argue with you that it happens or doesn't happen, but there's this sense of, well, I'm going to put my trust in it, even though I can't prove it, even though it may not be the case, but I find comfort in it. And as you said, well, we'll find out at some point, but if it provides meaning and comfort now, I think that's a worthwhile, powerful thing.
Well, here's a distinction, and this does relate to meaning, not going into a new conversation about whether or not there's life after death. But to imagine that provides meaning. And to me, a thing that's very important to meaning is whether something is true. I don't want to invest. I feel committed to understanding what really is and basing the meaning in my life around what really is, and
not just what gives you comfort.
Not just what gives. I don't want to find or believe. I want to root out every possibility that I could be investing my concept of what's meaningful in life in something that's not true. So it's meaningful for me to do a lot of work to make sure that what I'm investing in with regard to meaning in life is true and real.
Good.
I have a different question. I was reading this last week, Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning. And he was talking about the one thing that is so crucial, as he talked about being in the concentration camps, that the people who faded away and died were the people who didn't find the one thing they wanted to live for. And for Frankl, it was religious, but he pointed out a number of different ways in which people found something to live for. Reminded me of City Slickers. The old cowboy who says you got to live for the one thing. So I guess my question is, do you think there is a one thing that unites everyone, like for all of humanity? I was thinking, you've been part of Accord, and there's a lot of religious diversity there, obviously, pub theology. I'm sure your clients are from a wide range of people. Do you find that there's one thing that tends to unite humanity in terms of meaning? And then maybe a part two is, what do you think of the one thing for yourself that is the key thing that brings you meaning for life? So kind of a two-parter, choose either side of it.
We didn't say we wouldn't ask hard questions.
I'll just go with the first.
Well, I could just ramble a bit about the first part, and it's a good question. Is there one thing that is common across the board? I think there are commonalities, certainly, and I think that's one of the things that I've so enjoyed about interfaith engagement and pub theology conversations, is sitting down with people coming from different frameworks of how do we understand human existence, and finding that we have a lot of things in common often. We have obviously disagreements about any number of things, but there is this common experience of being human and having relationships, caring about people, wanting our neighborhoods and communities to do well, wanting to see children have the best life possible, wanting to see us taking care of this planet that we're living on and that's sustaining us. And so I think there are a lot of commonalities. I don't know if I could pick out one, though, because that's hard, and I think we do have different points about ultimate meaning that just are different and may be points of disagreement. But I think there's a lot of here in this life, here and now, let's get along together, that's very common, and that people actually have more of than perhaps we realize. We just aren't together enough with people of those different voices.
I agree with Bryan that there's several common elements that much of humanity finds meaning in, and I think the reason for that is, one, as you described, we inhabit a society together, but also we have a common biological heritage. So we don't all have the same wiring, but we all have a lot of overlapping wiring. So we have a lot of the same compulsions. We find meaning in a lot of the same things, which is communal interaction and maybe being part of something bigger than ourselves and things like that. So.
I'll take a little different slant on this. When I'm working with clients, I'm always looking for frameworks that help me to understand and see where they are, as well as using the framework on myself. And so one of the frameworks I've used is some work that Ken Wilber did, and it's about looking at the stages of life, and I don't have that down to a science, but he looks at 6 or 7 different stages that we go through, and then actually divides them down into 3 stages, which really makes sense to me and help me when I'm working with clients to figure out where are they at in their growth as a human being, because that kind of determines their needs at the time. But you know, the first stage, which he defines as being 0 to about 24, is a very egocentric, all about me, where the middle stage is more ethnocentric, where we're really moving out there and saying, hey, my community is important to me, you know, the world is important to me. And then he defines also a final stage, which is world-centric, which we would, I don't know that any of us here have experienced, I shouldn't speak for everybody else, but you know, it's a more of a Christ consciousness or Dalai Lama, Buddha, you know, people that we would say have evolved to that level, that are kind of have arrived or have self-actualized or whatever. But one of the most interesting things that he talks about in about the stages is what happens when you are between stages. You know, that when we're in one of those stages, whatever it is, we're confident, we know what we believe, you know, we'll argue our point, but there comes a time when we begin to question, when maybe the structures that we've had in place stop working for whatever reasons, and so we're kind of in between those stages, and it's in between stages that we probably do our most growth, that we start to really question, that nothing makes sense to us, that we have to begin to let go and open to, okay, if this isn't working, what's next? And that can be a long or short period of time, but I see a lot of people that are really struggling during those times. My life's falling apart. It might be everything's falling apart. I'm getting a divorce. Nothing feels good to me anymore. And sometimes it comes crashing down on them. Other times it's, I've got everything. I've got the perfect family. I've got a good job. I've got all this stuff, but I'm not happy. It's just not working for me. So it can come from different ways, but I found if I can begin to identify what stage people are at and are they between stages, and help them to begin to see, you know, identify the crisis that they're in and that they can get through it, and it's actually a good thing.
So we have just a few minutes left, and if you're willing, I'd like to hear from each of you, if it's okay, to share a little bit about your own sense of meaning that you found in your own life. I'll leave it at that. I'll leave it with no more explanation.
I just talked, so.
I'm happy to go. You know,
in 35 seconds.
Sure. I grew up in in the church, and I'm now a pastor, and I think, and Anthony asked, is there one thing? I mean, I think one of the things that has been meaningful to me is this environment of bringing people together of differing views and opening up to learning new things, and not assuming we have arrived, not being in that stage of I know everything that is, I'm very secure. I like that environment of challenging ourselves, learning from each other, opening people up to new views, because I think that helps us as humanity get to know each other better. It helps each of us grow as individuals, helps me, and that provides great satisfaction and meaning even as I seek my own journey as someone seeking to follow in the steps of Jesus.
Any thoughts, Scott?
Sure. In my pursuit of meaning, I identified some of those things, you know, the moment-to-moment things, the creative expression through boat projects, art, relationships, fixing bicycles, seeing people, and that comes from the death thought experiment. And there's another thought experiment that's related to that, and that is, if you lose some of your facilities, you know, at what point does life at what point is life no longer meaningful? If you lose your ability to move, you know, your arms, your legs, if you lose your ability to feel, communicate, you know, at what point, it's kind of a pull the plug thought experiment, right? And to me, I cherish, I treasure what I'm able to do with my hands and my mind physically, creatively. But most of all, I draw great meaning from my thought life. If I have the ability to think and communicate, then I want the plug left in. There's a variation of the death thought experiment. And I'll mention here, I didn't take an opportunity to define humanism for folks, but I realized that I'd always been an atheist and a humanist, and then when I found an organization of people who are also atheists, agnostics, and humanists, I was always enthused about life, but there was another notch by which I was able to come alive when I found that community. And humanism is a philosophy of living, of pursuing meaningful lives and the greater good without reliance on the concepts of the supernatural. And I find great meaning in that philosophy.
And I suspect that we all want to find that something that makes us come alive, and we all want to connect, whatever that is for us. But I think I was born searching for meaning. I was born, my mother was 19 and a widow. My father died in a car accident, so I was born with that idea that something was missing from my life that everybody had and I didn't. So it started me on that journey of searching and took me into religion when I was young and a teenager. And of course I had veered way far away from that, and I've gone on many journeys, but there were times in my life when I realized, I look back and I realized I was looking for utopia, and made a couple journeys thinking, this is where I'll find it. And you probably know the answer to that, because they're, you know, I obviously didn't find it. But my most recent search for utopia was hiking across Spain last fall. And I felt very called to do that. And it was a 35-day hike. And it felt to me like a spiritual pilgrimage. And I went into it thinking, I'm going to find some answers here. And I came home with more questions than answers. And so the journey kind of just continues. It continues. But for me, I think it is just a continual journey. There's times when I feel like I have answers, and then times when I have to let those answers go and just to see what comes up. But I think it's about loving the journey.
We have 1 extra minute. Do you want to share yours?
You know, I just thought, you want me to share mine?
If you do,
I think mine is similar to Brian, yeah. I'll go 30 seconds.
That's how you're going to leave it? Ditto? You're going to say ditto?
Ditto, Brian. I find meaningfulness in my faith, but then I also agree I find meaningfulness in my family. Yeah. I really like your thought experiments, Scott, especially the one that I look back on life. What are the things I'm going to think, I wish I'd done more of that? Play with my kids. Yeah. I really enjoy conversations like this, and was part of pub theology. And there's a lot of very practical things that you've identified as common unifiers and common ways that people find meaning. So while we disagree on some of the capital M meaning things in life, I think there is a very strong commonality and connection with a lot of the everyday, ordinary moments. Yeah.
And as host, I usually give the last word, so I'll take it away with mine then, since we have another minute. So I think my journey, my look to meaning is similar to yours, Vickie. As an artist my whole life, I've kind of bounced around from passion to passion. You know, I tend to be a person who's like a firework. I passion for something, and then it kind of fizzles out and wanes, and I'm off to something else. And I used to. That used to bother me. It was something about myself that I thought, why can't I stick with something? Why can't I, you know? And now that I'm getting older, I embrace that more. Right now, I'm passionate about this, you know, and put all my energy into that. And but there has been a thread in my life, and that thread has always been nature and animals. And so my passion right now, and what I'm finding meaning in right now, is being a voice for the innocent, for animals who can't speak for themselves. And you know, there's a lot of not so nice things going on in the world and how we treat animals. And so for me, it gives me a lot of a sense of meaning to step into that role. So that's where I'm at. Love your animals. So I'm going to leave it at that. I took the final word today, and I thank you, all three of you, for joining us in this wonderful conversation. And for those of you at home in the audience, thank you for tuning in to In Focus.